everyone, I'm Dr Becky Appleton, a researcher specialising in youth mental health, and today I'm going to focus on presenting and disseminating your findings. So you've done your study, you've collected all of your data, analysed it and written up your results. Why should you disseminate these findings to other people? Isn't it enough that you found out the answer to your research question? There's a few important reasons why dissemination is important. Firstly, it can help let others with similar interests know about your research. This could potentially help you to build your network and make new collaborations and meet other people with similar interests who you could potentially work with in the future. It also helps to maximise the impact from your findings. So rather than your results maybe just benefiting your own practice or your own setting, this could help inform other research and perhaps result in change in practice elsewhere. If you think about all research as slightly incrementally advancing knowledge each time a research study is done, your research could form an important step in helping others to set up new research and build on your findings. Depending on your area of study, there's also a chance that your findings could inform policy development, both at a local or national level. Perhaps the most common way of sharing research findings is through academic publishing. This involves writing up your research according to a specific journal's format. So, for example, you might want to submit your study to the British Medical Journal or the British Journal of General Practice. Choosing a journal can depend on your field and perhaps also the methods used in your research. Academic publishing also enhances the rigour of research, as when you submit your journal for publication, it goes through a process known as peer review. So this is where other experts in your field are invited to review and critique your paper. This can often result in some revisions that need to be made before preparing your final version, which is the version that's published. As I mentioned, this is the most common method of disseminating academic results, and there are a few good reasons for this. So going through the peer review process is a good way to enhance the credibility of your results because they've been checked and reviewed by other experts in your field. Academic journals are generally read by other academics and perhaps other experts or clinicians in your field. So this means that your research has potential to go on to inform their own practice or any research they might do in the future. It also looks good on your CV to have a publication. There's some amount of prestige associated with the number of publications that you get as a researcher or a clinician. However, whilst this is the most common method and historically has been the main method of disseminating your findings, there are definitely some cons to this approach too. The journal format can feel dry and inaccessible to some groups of readers. I'm sure you're all aware of the format of journal articles, and it is generally quite similar across the board and requires a certain level of detail, which perhaps just isn't interesting to certain groups of readers. For example, when thinking about policymakers, they don't have time to read a whole academic paper to try and find out what your key messages are. And similarly, patients as well, it's not a format which is accessible to them, especially as this paper might be behind a paywall, so they wouldn't even have access to it in the first place. Because of this, academic papers are generally read by other academics, clinicians, and other experts, but not a wide group of people, and certainly not the general population. So here are some alternatives, although perhaps we shouldn't think of them as alternatives, but instead as add-ons. So things that you can do in addition to publishing your work in an academic journal. Again, common examples are things like conference presentations. This could be through the form of a verbal PowerPoint presentation, or perhaps presenting a poster which outlines your key findings. And I've got an example of this coming up in a later slide. Another nice way to disseminate your findings is through internal seminars. This could be within particular research groups of interest, or if you have seminars within your setting or NHS trust. This is a way that you can disseminate your findings to a local audience, which again, depending on your field, might be a really good way to maximise local impact from your research findings. However, these top 3 examples are all still based on disseminating your findings to other people like you. So this could be other clinicians or other academics. If you want to try and maximise the impact of your findings across other settings, perhaps general population or people who might work across different fields, then you might want to try strategies which have a slightly wider reach. This could be through things like blog posts, so writing a short summary of your key findings. This can include your key take-home messages and often includes things like images to make the content feel a bit more engaging. An example of this is writing for existing publications, for example, like The Conversation. And again, I've got another example of this coming up in a later slide. You may also consider writing your findings in the form of a policy briefing. So this is similar to a blog post, although you may still use a slightly more formal tone. But this is where you really drill down into the key findings and the implications of these findings in a way that might be more useful for policymakers. So, unlike a journal article, these wouldn't include a lengthy background section or a really detailed methodology. You may include a few key points which lead towards your rationale for why this research was needed, and you would perhaps say what you did in terms of an overarching methodology. So, you conducted a trial or you interviewed 30 people, but you wouldn't go into the level of detail expected in a published paper. Another quite nice example, which I've used a few times in my own research, is designing or paying a graphic designer to design an infographic. This can be a way of presenting your findings visually in a way that is really easily accessible, especially for busy clinicians who don't have time to read a whole article or even a briefing document. Infographics can get your point across in a way that is easily digestible and can perhaps be turned into other images and posters which you can put up in your own settings. These can also work really well when shared on social media. And finally, you may be interested in doing a podcast to talk more about your research. Sometimes researchers or clinicians are invited onto established podcasts to talk about their research findings, or sometimes research groups or special interest groups have their own podcasts which you can then disseminate, again via social media. An advantage of this method is that it allows you to have a conversation about your findings and about the implications, rather than relying on a written format. This can help your findings potentially engage new audiences, and again, this is also a format which is really easily digestible by people who might not be experts in your current field. Here is an example of an effective conference poster presentation taken from Sage Research Methods, and I've included a link to this at the end of this presentation so you can find out more. It's got other formats and some other useful tips for designing a conference poster which you might want to have a look at. I think this poster works really well because it clearly conveys this research, for example, through the use of alliteration in the title, the creative use of comic book style imagery, and having clearly defined sections for each section of the research. So you have your background, your aims and methods, your results, etc. They've used images really well here, so both with the comic strip but also with the graphs that they've presented, which are really clearly labelled and defined. There's nothing worse than seeing a huge graph on a poster with no labels or no explanation, especially if you're not someone who's familiar with a particular field. I also like how they've used a fairly cohesive colour palette throughout, and this means that it's actually quite easy to spot the relevant information in this poster, and it's visually quite appealing. You can see on the right hand side of the screen a kind of example format that this poster's used. As I mentioned, there are other examples on this website, so I really recommend having a look. But this is one common format, but including a graphical abstract, which is where you present the whole findings from your study as if it's an abstract in a research paper, but using images instead, which again makes it a lot easier and more engaging for the reader to be able to find out what you did and why. I mentioned blog posts earlier, and here are a couple of examples. So in the top example, this is taken from the website The Mental Elf, which publishes blog posts on a variety of topics in mental health research. They also have other related sites for other areas of health, so it might be worth having a look and seeing if your field is represented. You can either get in touch with them to say, I've done this project, please can you write a blog post about it? Or you can sign up to be a blogger, where you might be sent new papers which have come out, where you can write a blog about them, which then goes on the website. The bottom example is a recent article from The Conversation, which publishes a wide variety of topics. Often academics and clinicians write articles around their research in a way which is easily understood by the general population and also includes engaging imagery. If you're designing PowerPoints or blog posts or conference posters, then here are some useful tools that you might want to use to add images or icons to your work. You can see here an example of a graphic which presents some qualitative research findings from my own research looking at youth mental health services. This was constructed using a platform called Napkin AI, which at the moment is a free platform which creates a variety of images based on text. So it's quite useful for things like icons, infographics, or like you can see here, presenting your research findings in quite an accessible and visually appealing manner. You might want to use Unsplash or Pexels for royalty-free images, so these are generally photos that you can use to illustrate your findings. Canva has free and paid versions, but is also a useful tool for designing things like infographics. And this also has an icons library, so you can use this to insert various icons or images into your poster or your slides. And finally, something that I've used quite a bit across these presentations is the icons library in PowerPoint. This is easy to use and it's helpful if you want to have a consistent feel across all of your slides. And finally, a few tips for effective dissemination. Start by thinking about what the key take-home messages would be from your research. When you disseminate your findings, it's really that you're talking about your findings and perhaps the implications of these. There tends to be less of a focus on the methods that you used in collecting your data, with the exception of if you're publishing in an academic journal or particular types of conferences which may focus more on methodology. You want to focus on why your research was important, what your findings were, and what are the implications of these findings. So, what should happen next as a result of your research? These implications can be aimed at different levels. So, for example, your findings may result in a change to clinical practice. So, that could be your focus, saying that a particular treatment had more evidence and should be implemented, or based on patient experiences of a certain intervention, you may want to change how things are conducted. Your results may have actually been inconclusive in certain areas, and in this case, you may identify a need for further research. A top tip if you do this, but try and be specific as possible. Don't just say, we can't say for sure, so more research is needed in this area. Instead, try and say exactly what research is needed. So, do you need to do this research to expand your findings into patients from minoritized ethnic groups who maybe were underrepresented in a particular data set? Or would it be helpful to try and replicate this study in another setting to see if the results still hold? The final implication is if your research could have some impact on policy. So this could be within a local level of your NHS trust or your own practice, or at a national level if you think that your findings could potentially inform national policy that's potentially something which is currently being debated at the moment. If so, it's useful to state this really clearly and concisely. An example of this is if a new drug has been found to be cost effective, and therefore a recommendation for policy could be that this treatment is adopted across the country. Another thing which can help you disseminate your findings is involving people with lived experience, which could perhaps be your patient representative group. They might be able to help think of creative ways to disseminate your findings which you hadn't thought of. And they might also have their own implications. So What do these findings mean to them as patients? My final top tip is keep things simple. In general, you want your findings to be understood by as many people as possible. So things like avoiding jargon or overly technical language can be really beneficial. Also, it's useful to think about what your key take-home messages are and stick to these. So rather than try and explain lots of different things you found, what are maybe the top 3 findings that you want to convey as part of your dissemination strategy? Finally, here are a few references and useful links. So the first one is the link from the SAGE Research Methods community, which has lots of helpful examples of different types of conference posters. And underneath are some other links to sites I've mentioned over the course of this presentation. That's all from this presentation, but you can see the direct link on screen to the catalogue hosted on NHS's Learning Hub platform. Registration is free, and if you have an NHS email, you will have free access to both the Learning Hub as a whole and the WE-R NHS catalogue resources. We have links to podcasts, videos, and journal articles on a range of topics related to education and workforce research. WE-R NHS is on YouTube, and we also have a regular e-newsletter. Thanks very much for watching.